This is the sound of crowd science.
We shoot a laser beam at this atom.
Is that a big canister of oxygen in the background?
Oh, there's a wasp in there.
Yep.
That's possibly the most disgusting thing I've heard this week.
But it's one of the nicest fun facts you're going to hear today.
So here I'm actually holding a donut.
What are you going to do with that?
Find out more at the end of this podcast.
Hello and thank you for downloading this episode of the Witness History podcast from the BBC World Service. 42 years ago, Saddam Hussein sent troops into Iran, marking the beginning of the Iran-Iraq War. Alan Johnston spoke to BBC presenter Puna Gadusi, who was just a child when it started, about her memories of that time.
It's September the 22nd, 1980, and the Iranian capital, Tehran, is bracing for war. Saddam Hussein's Iraq has just launched an invasion. But at the time, one little girl found it hard to take the danger seriously.
I remember not being allowed to turn the lights on in our house because everybody in the whole city was supposed to keep their lights off so that the airplanes would not know where the capital is and wouldn't be able to bomb it. And to me, it was just like, oh, come on, you can't be serious. You're making up a story.
Pune Gadusi, who's now a BBC television presenter, was just 8 years old when the war broke out. She was far too young to understand that her country was in a desperate fight.
6 days after the conflict degenerated into war, the city of Abadan is still being constantly shelled by Iraqi troops. The sky is heavy with the clouds of burning oil as refineries explode.
The war was rooted in bitter regional rivalry. Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran loathed Saddam Hussein. The Iranian leadership saw him as a tyrant who suppressed their fellow Shiite Muslims in Iraq. Saddam felt threatened, and he also believed that Iran was weak and vulnerable following the turmoil of its Islamic revolution the year before. He attacked, hoping for a swift victory, but was soon painfully disillusioned.
The Iranian troops, even though they are being subjected to ceaseless attack, are continuing to resist.
I had cousins and relatives who were killed or martyred, as they say, in the war. I also had cousins and relatives who'd fled the country at the age of 17, 18 because they didn't want to serve in the war. We went to some party and I had no idea why everybody was crying, although it seemed like a regular family gathering. And then the next day we would realize that was in fact a secret goodbye party for a young 18-year-old relative who was going to go illegally through the border the next day to Turkey or to Pakistan, and they couldn't announce it. But the grown-ups knew what was going to happen, and we were again completely oblivious to why everybody seemed to be depressed that night.
And terrible fighting was going on the front lines. There were human waves, Iranian forces sending huge numbers of soldiers into minefields, throwing themselves at Iraqi trenches. You were aware of that kind of fighting?
We saw those pictures all the time on television. And we saw people handicapped and what we call John Boz, which means a person who is prepared to sacrifice their lives for the country and for Islam. They were giving interviews. I remember the bandanas they were always wearing on their foreheads, red or green, with some Quranic writing on them saying, I am prepared to martyr myself for Islam, or I am going to get closer to God very soon when I get martyred. And they would distribute the same red and green headbands in high schools for us as well, and we did military singing and chanting in high school every morning in the assembly, revolutionary songs, and it was just like a performance every morning. And then you go to school and then we listened to Michael Jackson under our Islamic gear in our ears, in our Walkmans, on the same day in the same school. At the same time, from among my own relatives and my own neighbours, there were many people who were completely honoured and glad to go and serve in the army, and everybody respected them.
And all over Tehran there must have been funerals at that time?
Plenty. The Iranian style of mourning is they arrange something like a king's chair, really, like a throne, And they put it at the corner of every street. It's lit in 5 or 6 different coloured lamps. And the poster of the dead person or the martyred person, none of them looked older than 25. I remember exactly the sentences on these posters, announcements of their death. Father and mother of so-and-so are very, not pleased, but at the same time very honoured to say that our son has died in the war, and we are very pleased that he's gone to heaven. It was a bit strange for me at that age going, what mother and father would be happy that their 20-year-old son has died.
One of the anthems chanted by Iranian troops on the front lines to boost their morale before big offensives. They drove the invaders out and advanced into areas of Iraq, but couldn't strike a decisive blow. And after the war settled into a stalemate, the two sides began to bomb each other's civilian centres in what became known as the War of the Cities.
We had this thrill rides in the first weeks of the bombardment. I remember getting in a car the moment we saw the rockets in the sky and sort of following it to guess what neighbourhood it's going to fall in and finding out where the crater of the bomb was. I mean, now looking back, I cannot even believe we thought it was fun or exciting to do that. But it was just a matter of a couple of teenagers and some cousins getting in a car and riding, going to find where it's going to hit.
And what would you find there at the place where it did come down?
There was this huge hole like the ones you see on the surface of the moon in the middle of buildings and neighbourhoods which were like 3 blocks or 4 blocks away from my own neighbourhood. In the beginning it was crowded and there were deaths happening and you could sometimes see blood on the walls that were left from half-ruined houses. But after the first couple of weeks, the city was almost like a ghost town because most of the people have moved out. Me and my family also decided to go out to the summer resort holiday part of Iran by the coast of the Caspian Sea. And you can imagine the population of those places had mushroomed, like small touristy towns had become lively cities with 1 million extra people living in them. And half the grown-ups used to go back to Tehran at least twice a week in order to do the work things that they had to do to continue living. And you can imagine the fear of the wives staying behind. Also in Tehran, whenever you knew what neighborhood the latest bomb had landed in, you were just calling everyone you knew in that neighborhood. I remember a relative who was in the hospital giving birth, and the red alert sirens went off, and all the nurses and the doctors left while she was halfway through giving birth. There were all sorts of horror stories happening in those days.
Eventually, after 8 years of fighting, those around Ayatollah Khomeini persuaded him that it was time for his exhausted nation to accept a deal that would halt the war. And Pune Guddusi remembers him appearing on television.
He was very charismatic. His face looked really powerful. And the speech started with, "Today I am drinking from this cup of poison and accepting the resolution which was stopping the war." The UN resolution, I remember the number 598. And the way he said it, it was very confusing because for me, again, being 16, 17 at the time, it wasn't obvious. Are we accepting a resolution that is bad for us or is that to our benefit? I couldn't really tell. I remember my classmates discussing this in break time, saying, does anyone know if we lost this war or if we won this war?
At least 500,000 people died in the Iran-Iraq war, and some estimates put the figure much higher. It's been described as one of the most protracted, most bloody, and most futile conflicts in recent history.
That was Alan Johnston speaking to Pune Guddusi in 2010 for that episode of the Witness History podcast from the BBC World Service.